Hello, crafters. This is Yana Smakula for SimonsSTM.com. Welcome back for another Yippee for Yana episode. All supplies I'm using for this project are listed and linked in the video description below. Have you ever colored with ink pads? Let me know in the comments below. In this video, I'm creating with a new stamp set from Simons STM called Beachcombing, and I have summer encouragement card to share. Here is a look at this set. It is a large 6x8 stamp set full of beautiful seashells. It is a building set, meaning you have the image outline and then the image solid layer. In this case, sometimes several solid layers, each for a different section of an image. This stamp set takes away the need to do coloring and allows you to add color to the images using the solid layer stamps and your ink pads. You, of course, can use these images, the outline images I mean, and color them using your favorite coloring medium if you want to, but if you are not into coloring, this is a great set to use to be able to add color to your stamped images. I have my mini MISTI stamping tool here in a sheet of Neenah Silver White 80-pound cardstock, and my first step is to stamp the seashell outlines in clear embossing ink and then heat set them using the Simons Stamp Antique Gold embossing powder. I treated my paper with an anti-static powder tool. You want to do this step every time you plan to do heat embossing, as it makes all the difference in the world and it helps you keep your embossing neat. Believe me. So once your stamping is done, add the embossing powder and heat set it using your heat tool. I did my heat setting off camera this time, but you guys know the drill. We've all done it a bunch of times. I popped the panel, the embossed panel, back inside my MISTI, and I'm now ready to color these images with my ink pads. I'm going to start with that large seashell, and my ink plan for this one is peachy, grapefruit, and mandarin. All of these are Simons STM positively saturated inks. I first ink up the entire layer and I stamp it in peachy ink. This is the lightest of all three. So next I use grapefruit. This is the medium color. And while holding the ink pad at an angle, I inked up just the edges of this image. I'm going to add a layer of white cardstock behind my MISTI door so you can see the inking process a little bit better. So next I have a small blending brush from Simons STM, and this is a crucial tool. This is a very important tool. This is a tool you will want to have to achieve the results that I'm sharing in this video. So I'm using the brush to soften the edge of the ink that is applied to the stamp. I simply tap over the ink edge with a brush. Now, if you've never tried this technique, do give it a go. Now, I did not invent this, and I'm not sure who did, but this is a brilliant way to add shading to solid stamped images without much effort. This is very easy. So once you are happy, close the lid of your MISTI and stamp the image. And now you have the shading added to your seashell. Isn't that cool? And it's just so easy to do. Now, if you don't have a blending brush, you can also use your finger. Although, I will say, using a small size blending brush usually works much better. Now, you can also use the brush to apply the ink to the stamp without bringing the ink pad to the stamp at all. Simply tap on the ink pad and then tap on the stamp until you have the desired amount of ink. With the MISTI, you can keep stamping and keep building the amount of ink until you are happy with the result. So I would say, start with a little bit of ink and just add more as you go. Now, this seashell has 2 more layers, and I'm going to repeat the process to stamp the entire image. Sometimes it is a little bit hard to twist your hand with the ink pad to add the ink at an angle. I couldn't figure out how to hold it from the left-hand side. You could see that I was kind of struggling there for a minute, but I managed in the end. Again, I used the brush, I softened the edge, and voila. I wanted this last layer, the layer that shows the inside of the shell, to be a little bit darker. So I used the medium color, grapefruit, for the base, and then mandarin, that's the darkest color, for the shading. It took me a minute to figure out the side which I wanted to shade, as I wanted to make sure the inside, the side that was closer to the shell, was darker. But, I figured it out. I inked it up. I softened it with a brush, and it looks fantastic. Next, I'm going to stamp the Starfish, and the Starfish has just 2 layers. I'm using the Sangria and Punch inks. I actually messed this one up, and I reversed the ink pads here. I wanted to use the lighter ink for the larger area and then the darker ink for the smaller area, but it is what it is. I stamped this one the way I did. I did go back to it later. I heat embossed 2 additional images and I re-stamped it using the Punch for the outside and the Sangria for the inside. And I also used Cheeky and Blush for the other Starfish. Now with the Starfish, I also used a white Jelly Roll pen and I added white dots inside those little circle areas on the image. Next, I'm going to stamp this oblong seashell, and here I'm using 2 colors, Latte and Cappuccino. And I'm going to show you a slightly different technique here. So first, we're going to stamp this layer using the Cappuccino ink. And here I am doing the double stamping to make sure I have the desired amount of ink on my paper. And then for the next layer, I'm using both of these inks. So Latte as the base layer and then Cappuccino to add shading. So I first stamped the Latte and now I have the Cappuccino and a blending brush. Now this time I'm not going to tap the ink onto the layer. Instead, I'm going to brush it or blend it onto the stamp. So when I stamp this onto my paper, I will end up having visible brush strokes. Sometimes the brush strokes are more visible, sometimes they're less visible, depending on your technique, depending on the amount of ink you have. But this is a very cool technique, another cool technique to try when adding shading to your image. This particular seashell has another layer, and I'm going to repeat the same steps for this small layer as well. So again, using Latte for the base and then shading with Cappuccino. We also have a sand dollar in the stamp set, and for this one, I'm going to show you something a little bit different. First, I'm stamping the sand dollar using melon ink, and next, I'm going to stamp it using Latte. So I'm mixing these 2 colors of ink on my paper, giving me a custom color. I wasn't sure what color I wanted to use. I didn't have the color that I wanted to use in my stash, and I figured I would make my own custom color instead. The sand dollar also has the detail layer, and for that, I'm using Cappuccino. I do have a somewhat limited color palette here. I did not want to use too many inks, but I wanted to instead show you how you can stretch your ink pads and create beautiful results. We have just one last seashell to stamp, and this one has, once again, 3 layers. I'm going to use the same ink colors for all 3 layers, and instead I'm just going to do shading. So here I'm using melon as my base color and then cantaloupe as my shading color. So for each layer, I'm inking the solid layer with melon, stamping that onto the paper, and then using cantaloupe to ink up just the edge of the seashell. Using my blending brush. This is actually the same blending brush that I was using before. I'm just going to clean it up on my paper, make sure I don't have any of that orange ink left. And then I'm just going to tap it to soften the edge and stamp that onto my paper. I am repeating this several times until I have the desired look on my paper. And once I'm happy, I just move on to the next layer and stamp that layer and then the 3rd layer in the exact same way. Notice how I pause for a second or 2 or sometimes even 3 seconds, and I really press the image and I wait for the ink to transfer onto the paper. I often find this is better than doing double stamping. I mean, I will still do double and triple stamping from time to time, but now I also just pause, give the ink time to soak into the paper, and then I move on. And our seashells are done. There are coordinating dies available, so I used mine and I cut these beauties out in my Platinum 6 die cutting and embossing machine. And now that we have all of our parts and pieces ready, it is time to assemble our card. I forgot to mention that I also created a sentiment for this card. For this, I used the Just Breathe stamp set. I love the font used here. So I heat embossed the sentiment in antique gold embossing powder, the same color embossing powder that I used for the outline of my seashells. The sentiment that I picked reads, "There are so many beautiful reasons to be happy." And of course, I cut it out using the coordinating die. Now let's go ahead and assemble. So here I have a panel of craft cardstock. This is cut to 3.5 by 4.5 inches, and I'm just going to use my die cuts to create a seashell arrangement. The sentiment is going to go in the center, and then the seashells are just going to frame that sentiment. I have already added foam adhesive squares to the back of my seashells, and I'm going to pop all of them up on this panel. I'm making sure that they overlap each other slightly, but none go outside the edge of this rectangle. I just want everything contained within the rectangle. And with that done, I go ahead and I add my sentiment on top. I want this to look as if the seashells are laying in the sand. And to emphasize that look, to create that look, in addition to using craft paper, I'm also going to use Copic markers and add some texture to the background. So first I'm using E31 and I'm just dotting little dots, little details, little shadows here and there, anywhere where I have a free spot, a free section on my background. This is going to add a ton of interest, a ton of detail to our card, and it's actually very easy to do. You really don't need to be fancy. You don't need to know how to do coloring. You're just adding tiny little dots onto your paper and, creating visual texture. Next, I'm using E33 marker, so adding slightly darker dots, and then I'm coming in with even darker Copic marker. This is E37 and adding even darker dots here as well. I also used a Jelly Roll pen, a white pen, and I added white dots onto this background as well because these kind of help create little specks, little highlights in my sand. Now that our background panel is done, all that's left to do is add it onto a card base. So here I have an A2 side folding card base, and I first thought I would add this panel, straight like I usually do. But then it kind of hit me. Why not add this at an angle? Maybe turn it a little bit. That's what I did. That's how I adhered my panel onto the background. I then removed the sentiment. Thankfully, it wasn't adhered too strongly onto the background because I haven't yet pressed down on the sentiment too hard. So I removed it and I repositioned the sentiment so that the sentiment is adhered straight on the card. And that finishes my card. So here's a look at the finished project. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you'll give this idea a try. If you haven't commented, do let me know if you have ever colored with ink pads. I'd love to know. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. Love you guys, and I'll see you in my next video.
Hi there, I'm Heidi, Simon's mama and founder at simonsaysstamp.com. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you like what you just saw, be sure to press the thumbs up and subscribe to see more great content.